Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The support of Western states, above all the United States, for Israel's genocidal war against Gaza rightly has more people talking about imperialism. But this brings up the question, what is imperialism? What are we talking about? And what's its relationship to capitalism today? So I'm joined on this episode by two guests, one of whom I've wanted to have on Victor's Children for a long time, and the other of whom was in the same category until he recently appeared for the first time in the most recently released episode of this podcast. So could you introduce yourselves? Jeff, could you go first?
Sure. I'm Jeff Weber. Thanks for having me, David. Big fan of the show, and always nice to chat with you and Charlie. It's been a while. I teach in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto, and for the last 2.5 decades or so, I've written a lot about Latin America and a fair amount on imperialism, not just about Latin America, but imperialism in general. And I've done most of that with a friend of mine named Todd Gordon. So we wrote Blood of Extraction, Canadian Imperialism in Latin America, and we've written more generally on imperialism in Science and Society, and have a new article coming out later soon in Spectre journal online on imperialism today. And finally, Todd and I are working on planning our next book on imperialism. So he can't be held responsible for anything stupid I say today, but Todd is a contributing thinker to most of the whatever merit of my contributions.
Okay, I'm Charlie Post. I still teach occasionally at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I've written, most of my writing so far has been about the origins of capitalism, but I've been writing in the last few years on questions related to imperialism. Recently published an article in Spectre looking at some of the more current theories of imperialism and trying to use much of the conceptual framework I got through my study of the origins of capitalism, and particularly the work of people like Anwar Sheikh, to try to develop a more rigorous theoretical understanding of imperialism.
Thanks very much. So to start off, when many people today are learning about imperialism or empire, when they're thinking about those things, what they're meaning by that is the domination of the world by so-called Western states like the US, the Canadian state, the UK, and so on, or even they may just be thinking about the United States. So what's right and what's wrong about this common way of thinking about imperialism?
Well, I think what's right about it is that it focuses on those ways of thinking about it attempt to focus on the relationship to the most economically competitive industrial capitalist powers, who also have, for not accidentally, the most developed military and political capacities for world domination. And it focuses correctly on the region of the world, the so-called global north, Western Europe, US to some extent, US, Canada, and to some extent Japan, which have been the major imperialist powers. Now, the problem with it, in my opinion, is twofold. One, it tends to make imperialism simply a contemporary phenomena, or which then a phenomena of capitalism, which then leads people to collapse the entire history of empire building. Sometimes some people going back to ancient Greece and Rome, many more people talking about the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the 17th and 18th century in the Americas as capitalist imperialism. There is, in fact, imperialism is a feature of every major class society that we've known in human history. Pre-capitalist imperialism had a very specific character because the extraction of surplus labor from producers was based on and involved what Marx would call non-market coercion, the political and juridical domination of non-producers over producers, and depended on political control of trade, various monopolies, etc. Pre-capitalist imperialism had a very specific character. It absolutely necessitated colonialism, formal colonies. It necessitated certain forms of merchant and other monopolies, and generally produced in the areas it dominated, reproduced non-capitalist class relations. What's the bigger problem, I think, politically today, of thinking of imperialism solely as the global north and maybe Japan, is that it then, I think, and this is something we'll probably come to through the course of today's discussion, it tends to ignore the other imperial powers that have emerged and their particular roles in the world. Particularly, I would argue, China, which has emerged in the last 20 to 30 years as a major industrial capitalist power that is beginning to assert itself in the world stage, both economically and politically and militarily. Clearly, as we can discuss later, it is still a very asymmetrical competition between the U.S. and the other imperialist forces, powers like the U.S., the EU, etc. But that conflict has to be understood, I think, in terms of as conflicts amongst imperialism. Because if we don't understand it that way, we then tend to become very disoriented politically.
I think complementing what Charlie said in relationship to how David you began about how it's commonly framed today, I think against that common understanding, we need, on the one hand, a more expansive theoretical point of departure of what we understand to be imperialism, and on the other hand, as Charlie began to do, a kind of more specific historical periodization of the different forms that it's assumed. So, at the most abstract level, I think we can understand imperialism to be a system of domination by one or more states of another state or states or regions or the entire world. Now, that obviously doesn't say very much, but it's a point of departure which allows for an understanding that in pre-capitalist societies, you had various pre-capitalist imperial forms, and that these then assume different dynamics and forms as capitalism develops. And the predominant way, just to build on Charlie's beginning, if you compare very briefly and schematically the Spanish and Portuguese feudal societies and the feudal empires that they built, political power in these societies was vested in the sovereign, in the landed elite, and in the church hierarchy, and the direct and personalized power that they accrued through their political and religious status was used to forcefully extract wealth from peasants domestically and the colonized abroad. And the way that this power congealed was in direct colonial territorial conquest and control. But the fact that these were feudal societies meant that the kind of wealth that they were seizing and the kind of transformations of the labor power that they encountered was effectively to extract precious metals, silver and gold, and precious luxury consumption goods. Because although they were feudal societies, the early transition to capitalism had begun in Northwestern Europe, but it was in a very early stage. So this is quite distinct, in other words, from what happens even with what we can call the transitional capitalist powers that again used direct colonial conquest in the scramble for Africa, say in the late 19th century, Britain, Germany, and France in their competing colonial expansion there. But you have an entirely transformed domestic system in each of these cases and an international market. So you have industrialized capitalist societies or rapidly industrializing capitalist societies in each of these three cases, and a world market transformed by the necessity of minerals and agricultural goods as inputs for manufacturing processes, and as for consumption, that it wasn't just merely luxury consumption, but mass consumption for new working classes in new urban settings. So a radically distinct dynamic. But what remained the same was that outside of Europe, they were confronting non-capitalist societies predominantly. Now, the insight of someone like Ellen Wood in her book, Empire of Capital, was that it's only by the conclusion of World War II that all international relations are fundamentally driven by the imperative of the law of value, or the imperative of capitalist dynamics for the first time. And that means that in light of the end of World War II, the massive decolonization that happens in the wake of World War II, the decline of European empires and the rise of the US, imperialism takes on a form which is predominantly non-colonial, that is not rooted in direct colonial long-term conquest. It doesn't mean, as any perusal of the newspapers today would suggest, the end of coercion, but it means the end of long-term territorial conquest and settlement as the primary driver of imperialism today. Of course, there remain settler colonies with settler colonial dynamics, but they are not the predominant logic of today's imperial mode. And that transition to a universalization of international relations that we can see concretized in the wake of World War II persists today, despite the obvious distinctions that we need to make between our contemporary period and that of World War II.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I'd like to now bring up a frequently referred to analysis of imperialism from over a century ago. The Russian revolutionary V.I. Lenin wrote a pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, although originally in Russian it was the newest stage, I believe. And this pamphlet remains a reading that some people who want to learn about imperialism today still go to. You'll see this, for example, on YouTube and other places where people are popularizing ideas about imperialism. And it's also, Lenin's perspective influences some people who think more seriously in a theoretical way about imperialism today. So I'd like to start by asking you what your thoughts are about how well Lenin understood imperialism at the time he was actually writing. And he wrote that pamphlet in 1916, and it was published the following year. And then after that, we can talk about how well this theory explains or doesn't explain imperialism today.
Well, I think that this was probably one of the most deeply flawed things that Lenin wrote, and that on a theoretical and to some extent even a political level, while it was important politically as an intervention, remember, he's writing this in the midst of the First World War, the first massive, direct worldwide inter-imperialist conflict that, again, on the one side you have Britain, France, it's out, and eventually it's what becomes the dominant power, the US, versus Germany and the so-called Central Powers. In the midst of in this period in 1914, to the surprise of most rank-and-file socialists, the Socialist International and the Socialist parties, which were massive at this point, did not fulfill their promise to oppose this war by any means, and in fact capitulated. Various then attempts were made by various socialists and pseudo-Marxian theorists to come up with justifications for why they were doing this. And Lenin's contribution, the imperialism pamphlet, which is really a sort of popularization of the work of his co-thinker, Nikolai Bukharin, is an important political intervention of saying this is an imperialist war, both sides are imperialists, workers have nothing to gain from either side. The problem for me is that it did not provide an adequate analysis of imperialism then, and it doesn't provide an adequate basis for analyzing imperialism today. Back in 1962, there was an article published in the International Socialism Journal by a guy named Michael Kidron, who was one of the founders of the International Socialists in Britain, which is now the British Socialist Workers' Party, where he basically argues that Lenin identifies several key features of imperialism: a merger of banking capital and productive capital, export of capital primarily from what we would call the global north to the global south, a number of other features, including monopolization. And Kidron pointed out very systematically that this was an inaccurate analysis, an accurate description, even at that point. That, in fact, except for Germany, you did not have this sort of fusion of banking and industrial capital. Those types of capitals remain quite distinctive in the rest of the industrialized capitalist world. The claim that there would be a fusion between the state and private capital was also highly questionable. At best, you could say that the German war economy into the First World War saw some of that, but you didn't see it in Britain, in the US, or these other powers. And even what Lenin's own data shows that while there is important flows of productive capital to the global south, the vast majority of productive capital is going from one industrialized country to another. Now, I think his insight about late 19th, early 20th century imperialism being something different, that it wasn't the export of commodities, but the export of capital, is important because, and I think this gets to the point that Jeff was raising, is that this begins the process by which imperialist powers come in and don't just rip off precious metals, don't just attempt to tax and appropriate surpluses produced by pre-capitalist producers, peasants, etc., but to actually begin to transform class relations in the global south, that we begin to see the emergence of capital and wage labor in the global south. But the vast majority of capital is not exported to the global south, but to other industrialized societies, as it is today. And I would even go further, that the whole concept of monopoly, of either the limitation of economic market competition among capitalist firms has disappeared, and the related notion that he and Bukharin raised, that it becomes displaced into simply political military competition, is fundamentally flawed. It is based on the importation into Marxism, and this is not original to Lenin. You see this in thinkers like Kautsky, like Hilferding, and others, that competition is equated with what mainstream economics would call perfect competition. Lots of small firms competing with one another. None of them have a dominant position, and this is the only way competition exists. Thus, when they do see the emergence of these large capital-intensive firms, they think, well, there's no more competition, which then gives rise to all sorts of notions about super profits, which are then used to bribe sections of the working class, etc. So I would argue that even when he wrote this was an inadequate theoretical framework for understanding capitalist imperialism as we're moving into the 20th century. And I think that since then, with decolonization, with the et cetera, it's become even less useful framework for understanding imperialism.
I think Lenin, some of Lenin's questions and political inclinations that led to the pamphlet remain relevant, even if many of the questions that he offered to the questions he posed were inadequate in some of the ways that Charlie was mentioning.
I agree with that completely.
So I think a number of these can be shown, for example, in his attempt to link, for example, the Great Depression of the late 19th century in Europe to the scramble for Africa, and how that external colonial competition between great powers fed back into the inter-imperial rivalry at the heart of World War I. All of these kinds of questions, that is to say, capitalist crisis, its relationship to imperialist expansion, and the intensification of inter-imperial rivalry, all remain relevant in terms of points of departure. Now, we needn't follow the path that Lenin took to analyzing them, and for a variety of reasons, we shouldn't accept many of the conclusions. But I think that's one point of benefit that we can still retain. Another is the notion of a chain of imperialism, which Lenin mentions. He doesn't call it an imperialist chain in that text, but those who have built upon Lenin's notion of what became known as Lenin's theory of imperialist chain remain, I think, relevant in different ways, in a way that needs to be developed, that Todd and I have tried to do in ways that I'll develop later in our discussion, probably. But I think that remains relevant. But I would agree with Charlie that with much of what Charlie said, with a stress especially on what I think is the most flawed component, which is the notion of imperialism as part of the monopoly stage of capitalism, which he didn't which wasn't, as Charlie mentioned, wasn't exclusive to Lenin, was shared more broadly, but it was problematic for both the reasons that Charlie suggested, that is to say, the limits of the theory of monopoly capital, but also to the extent to which not just that competition persisted in this period, but also the notion that imperialism in its capitalist form is, I think, coextensive with capitalism per se, and not specific to any stage, whatever stage we talk about today prior to our present stage. So the theoretical question is not, what came after imperialism of whatever stage, but what form is imperialism assuming? And I don't think we get out of imperialism until we get out of the capitalist mode of production.
Just to sort of expand on a point that Jeff just made, I mean, Lenin, like everybody in the Marxian movement in the early 20th century, is responding to what appears to be a very new world in which capitalism is finally breaking out of, capitalism is by the 1860s and 70s, had finally consolidated itself in what we today call the global north. Central Europe, with German industrialization, Britain, US, Canada, Japan, Italy, etc. And then by the 1880s and late 1880s and 1890s, we're seeing this incredible expansion, not just simply of colonial possessions and spheres of influence, but this goes along with this massive transformation in what we today call the global South of class relations, of the emergence of capitalist class relations in the global South. And with it comes, after 20, 30 years of what seemed to be peace amongst the dominant powers, renewed political and military tension. Now, we also have to sort of step back and realize that Lenin was not the only person attempting to explain imperialism at this point. There were other competing theories by people who shared Lenin's political commitments to opposing imperialist war, etc., whether that be Rosa Luxemburg and a number of other thinkers at that point. For better or worse, because the Bolsheviks lead the first successful and very short-lived socialist revolution and become the driving force in the new Communist International, Lenin's imperialism becomes a new orthodoxy, and people forget about or don't actually try to grapple with both the strengths and weaknesses of alternative theories.
Before we go on, is there anything else you'd like to say about perhaps what's not helpful about trying to use Lenin's framework for understanding imperialism in the world today?
Well, I think for me, it's the notions of monopoly, the notion that the only way that capitalism survives is through the extraction of super profits, higher than average profits from the global South, etc., has been, while it was not Lenin's intent, has become a theoretical justification for politics that sees, and this I'll get back to when we talk about some of the contemporary theories, a politics that sees, in a sense, a class realignment on a global scale, where we no longer see, where the world is no longer divided between capital and labor. And yes, there are tiers of capitalist powers, some dominant, some subordinate, but even the subordinate capitalists have an antagonistic relationship with their own working classes, and the working classes of the more dominant powers do not cease to be potentially conflictual. So what Lenin's theory has allowed, versions of it have allowed, is this notion that we have seen a displacement of class capital labor struggle in every capitalist society by a conflict between imperialist and non-imperialist states, where on the one hand, the working classes of the global North have been bribed and are in a historic and enduring block with their own ruling classes. And in the global South, the so-called national bourgeoisie, national capitalist class is in fact can ally itself with its own working class. That those antagonisms between capitalists and workers can tend to disappear in politics that tries to use Lenin as a theoretical foundation.
So then, other than Lenin's work, what are the most other influential ways of understanding imperialism that you see on the left today, and how do you assess them?
Well, I'll go first because that's what I did the article in Spectre about. I mean, since Lenin's theory, starting in the 60s and 70s, there were growing numbers of Marxists, both in the global North and global South, who questioned his theory of imperialism. One of the most influential was the work of Aguirre Emanuel, a Greek Marxist, who wrote a book it came out in English in 72, I believe, called Unequal Exchange, in which he argues that the problem is not monopoly, but global competition. That what he argues is you've got this integrated world economy, you get an equalization of profit rates through competition on a global scale, and this gives rise to a process of value transfers. Marx in Capital talked about how in the process of competition and the equalization of profit rates, prices are no longer directly determined by values, the amount of human labor embodied in any given commodity, but by costs of production, prices of production. That this allows then surplus value produced by more labor-intensive producers to be transferred into the pockets of more capital-intensive producers, so that you don't have a situation where garment manufacturers have a higher rate of profit than steel companies. What Manuel does is he extends this globally with the assumption that uniformly the capital intensity is higher among industries in the global North, and labor-intensive production is dominant in industries in the global South. And thus there he sees that imperialism, the unequal development of the world economy, is primarily the result of these transfers of value. And most recently, Michael Roberts and Parchetti, whose first name I don't want to mispronounce, wrote this very, very, I think, one of the strongest cases for an unequal exchange argument in the journal Historical Materialism about 3-4 years ago, in which they attempt to measure it. Now, the problem, I think, with this theory is twofold. One is it doesn't explain why, for the most part, you have capital-intensive industries in the global North and labor-intensive industries in the global South, which I think can only be explained by capitalist competition. Secondly, even that article, which attempts to measure this, assumes that all of the commodities exported from the global South are produced in labor-intensive labor processes, garments, electronic components, etc., and that everything they import from the global North is capital-intensive, machine goods, steel, cars, etc. But that's not, in fact, the case. Particularly in the post-Second World War period, we see the growing importance of extractive industries in the global South, whether it be petroleum, whether it be minerals, that are highly capital intensive. So it's the theory of unequal exchange, I don't think explains why you have global uneven and combined development to begin with. And B, it's not clear which direction these value transfers are going. Another theory that's been developed by this guy, John Smith, in his book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, is what he calls super exploitation. That since at least the 1970s, if not before, capital has been able to drive down the value of labor power, wages in the global South, so that wages do not even cover the reproduction of workers' capacity to work. That this then unleashes this process by which there's a wholesale movement of industry from the global North to the global South, and that, as his argument is, then we see no development of labor productivity anymore. All of capitalist development is based on the super exploitation of workers in the global South, which he implies and at points or explicitly argues these super profits are then shared with workers in the global North. The problem there's a number of theoretical and empirical problems, the most important being that Smith provides no evidence of super exploitation and no evidence of consistently lower rates of exploitation in the global South and the global North. And then there's been a more recent attempt to, I'd say, revise and rescue Lenin's theory of imperialism by an Australian Marxist named Sam King. And in his book, he argues what we have is not firms that have monopoly power in the market, where they can set prices and have as high profits as they want, but instead where firms in the global North have an effective control over the most capital-intensive, technologically developed labor processes, and in the global South, capitalists are limited to more labor intensive, less technologically developed industry. Now, I think this argument is one way empirically true, but again, it doesn't explain why that division exists. And it looks solely to manipulation by states, international organizations, et cetera, their manipulation of the terms of trade that prevent capitalists in the global south from imitating those in the global north. Now, all three of these theories today are, again, quite compatible with arguments, whether their authors make them or not. I would argue that Roberts and Carcetti do not make this argument and would probably reject it politically, but Smith and King would embrace a notion of a class realignment, that workers in the global north have been bought off and are allied with their own capitalist class, and workers in the global south have more in common with their own capitalists than they do with workers in the global north. And it's also used, and I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail later, to basically deny that China has become an imperialist power that is beginning to compete on the world scale. And in the article I wrote, I try to go through very clearly why, particularly the reasons that both King and Carcetti and Roberts give about why China is not imperialist are inadequate. And that, in fact, the evidence points to that they are an emerging and rising imperialist power, having a place in the world economy not much different from the US and Germany in the late 19th century today. So, yeah, those are the three theories I see that are profoundly flawed.
Jeff, would you like to join in here?
Sure. I think if we look at the post-Cold War period, you see various waves of returns of interest to the question of imperialism. And in the 90s, a kind of low point of theorization on imperialism, you had globalization debates and out of those, to the extent that imperialism was still part of the question, some associated theories or critiques of imperialism emerged. So I'll speak about those. And then I think around the Iraq War, you get a new revival of interest in imperialism, a new uptick in wave of theoretical engagements. And those were significantly more advanced, I think, than the earlier wave. And then since the 2008 crisis and subsequent wars, you have a whole new interest emerging. So out of that globalization and post-Cold War period, you have, I think in 2001, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have a very influential book called Empire that emerges, which in a different theoretical language expresses a much wider sentiment of the period, that the expansion of global production and exchange, and also the production of communication technologies and cultural flows and so on across borders have built new forms of networked power that diminish the national state form. And so that whatever the merit of classical Marxist theories of imperialism in the early 20th century, they have been eclipsed, not for the reasons that we've talked about today, but for this reason of the decline of the nation state. Now, I think one could argue logically that there's no necessary logical reason why you need a multiplicity of nation states to reproduce. Capitalism, one could imagine, as a thought experiment, a federated system of governance that managed local governance and reproduction by some other means. But this would be purely at a speculative, logical level. Historically, the entire, however many hundreds of years you want to date it back to, the history of capitalism, it doesn't particularly matter precisely where you begin it. The whole history of capitalism inherited pre-capitalist states, which they then retooled and reinforced. And in fact, if anything, a dynamic of state formation and state congealment and the growth of new states has been the dynamic of capitalism and its imperialism since its inception. So it was quite misguided, I think, from that outset. But capitalism has required the territorial, juridical, coercive, both everyday and emergency powers of states to reproduce the environment for the profitable and regular accumulation of capital. And so that was the reason fundamentally that empire was a fundamentally misguided notion from the start. A different version of this thesis from a very different theoretical starting point, but nonetheless with some shared features of the globalization debate, was the so-called emergence of a transnational capitalist class and an associated transnational state, which was still, to be fair to the theory, always seen as an incipient transnational state, not one that had been achieved, but was nonetheless the predominant form. These international institutions were expressing the conscious class expression of a interlocked, networked transnational capitalist class with a shared set of homogeneous interests. And therefore, coercion was still required, and no transnational entity of coercion had been developed. So they required, for the moment, U.S. military to act on behalf of that transnational capitalist class. But when the U.S. military intervened, it wasn't in the interests of U.S. capital, but in the interests of this entity of transnational capital. Now, this caught more of reality than the empire theory, in the sense that you could point to empirical studies of interlocking firms and so on that had non-obvious headquarters and operations across multiple terrains. But the evidence was always much sparser for this sort of grandiosity of the claims and the homogeneity of any such class. So although there were empirical trends that you could point to of certain transnational features of operations, it was overblown, the notion of the transnational capitalist class, but the transnational state was even more far-fetched. Okay, and there was no sense in which they were riddled with contradiction and rivalry. These were ruled out because of the sort of cohesive character of this class that would work together. Alongside, and again, a separate theoretical trajectory, but sharing features of these other two were theories of U.S. supremacy, right, or even U.S. Omnipotence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so you can point to many theoretical expressions of this, but one influential one was Leo Panitch and Sam Ginden's The Making of Global Capitalism. But you can find it in many others. It's shared by the predominant view on the New Left Review editorial perspective for most of this period, and various other expressions, both liberal and Marxist, right? But I'm focusing on the Marxist dynamics here. And so there was the basic problem with this was twofold, I think. The first was the mistaking the fact of U.S. dominance. I mean, it was a fact in the post-Cold War period, even in the post-World War II period, but in the post-Cold War period, it was a fact of dominance as mistaking that for omnipotence, that is friction-free, contradiction-free reproduction of U.S. Global order, in which all expressions of power of other dominant states were merely the expressions of the U.S. empire's interests as refracted through its different allied states. So when the British did something bad in the world, it was because of their subordinate allied relationship to the United States. When the Canadian state did something in Latin America to pursue its interests of Canadian capital, it was because of its relationship with the United States. That is to say, there was no room for even bounded autonomy of other states, even very dominant states in the world. And this meant that there was no possibility of explaining any kinds of activities of even dominant states, allied or not with the United States, except as a subordinate expression of U.S. power. There was also an associated problem in their conception of state power in general, which was that it was very limited to a concept of effectively reducing the American state to the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and dissolving the notion of a much broader conceptualization U.S. state power. So even on the terrain of the U.S. state, not seeing the interrelated roles between the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the State Department, and the Pentagon, for example. So the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on didn't figure it whatsoever in this notion of imperialism, which is a fairly astonishing feature of an analysis of imperialism in this period. But even at the height, it never explained. Even at the height of U.S. supremacy, it never explained the kind of unevenness and contradictions which didn't dissolve. But today, this is even clearer, right? In the sense of the emergence of China and even a non-potential great power, Russia, which is certainly not a great power, but nonetheless has all kinds of regional room for maneuver and expansionary aims, which are not reducible to its defensive reactivity to U.S. imperial overreach. And so that's one dominant thing. A kind of distorted mirror image of this are which has gained prestige of late on some sections of the left, is a multipolarity thesis. It's a distorted mirror image of U.S. supremacy because there's still a singular U.S. imperium. The distinction is that the U.S. imperium is in decline, not in descendant. So it's in decline not because of inter-imperial rivalry, but because of new antinomies between a block of states. They differ depending on the theory, but usually involving Russia, China, sometimes involving Iran, Venezuela, what have you. Different states that sometimes the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, together as challenging U.S. empire in various ways. And so no matter the social structure or political proclivity of these states, they're seen by definition to be ipso facto anti-imperial insofar as they run into conflict with the single imperium of the U.S. So this was an equally unsatisfactory reading, but one that shared certain premises of the first one, of the U.S. supremacy. And the final one I'll just mention, which I think is important, is the dual logics thesis, or theses, I guess. And here you have more sophisticated and interesting discussions, but nonetheless flawed. So you have, in different forms, Giovanni Arrighi's dual logics in his work in his late life just before his death, not the book on China, but earlier expressions of his dual logics in extensive interviews in New Left Review, for example. David Harvey, who was teaching a course with Arrighi at the time at Johns Hopkins, also develops this notion of a territorial logic on the one hand, the logic of state management, and this is a different logic from the logic of capitalist expansion, which expands beyond states. And imperialism is a theory, as Alex Kalinikos put it in a third contribution to this dual logics, independently arrived at. Kalinikos emphasizes in his book, he hadn't read Harvey's book, but he arrives at the same solution, which is that basically you have a logic of statecraft, which is territorially bound, and a logic of capitalist expansion, which is not bounded territorially. And geopolitics is their intersection, which basically brings them back to a kind of either implicit or explicit rapprochement with realism theory in international relations, in which states are seen to have these kinds of interests that they pursue, which are rational on their own terms. So I won't go into all of the reasons in which this is a problem theoretically, but just to say that it's much more fruitful, we think, to begin with the notion of an integrated dialectical unity between state and capital in the current period. And what that means is that at a minimum, all states, not just weak states, all states are subordinate to the law of value and its operations on the world market. What distinguishes them is how, from what point of weakness and dominance are they disciplined, and in which ways are they disciplined by those competitive logics. But they can't, no state is outside of that logic or outside of the expansionary or contractionary tendencies of what's happening at the level of the world scale of the world market. And so that law of value and the competitive logic of capitalism on an international scale means that is internal to the logic of statecraft, not something external to it. And it's not a question of economic reductionism, but a question of integrating all of the dimensionalities of state power, and in this question, imperial state power, in that context. There's much more to say empirically about what that means, but let's just say understanding it as two separable logics is unhelpful.
Just to sort of concretize further what Jeff was saying, which came out of his and Todd's article in Science and Society, and the thing I wrote in Spectre, I tried to say, okay, how can we go from the logic of the law of value, of real competition among capitalist firms, into political military rivalry? And I relied pretty heavily on there's a German theorist in the 70s, Joachim Hirsch, who had written extensively on he was part of this debate about what were the limits of back in the 70s was called state economic policy. And as a counter to those who claimed on both the social democratic and the official communist left that the state could somehow manage capitalism and prevent crises that are internal to the dynamics of the law of value, he was among the theorists trying to argue about its limits. And what his formulation was is that capitalist state economic policies, so-called intervention, are limited to attempting to mobilize counter tendencies to the falling rate of profit. And amongst those that Marx outlines are the global expansion of capital. Because when you go, one of the things that was very clear, even in the 19th century, is that investments by the dominant capitalist powers in what are becoming their frontiers was tended to be less capital intensive and thus had higher profit rates. And what I tried to argue is that if we live in a world that at least historically has always been one of multiple states, I'm a little bit more agnostic than Jeff on whether you can even do a thought experiment to come up with a single state. But historically, we live in a world of multiple states, each state attempting to carve out portions of the world where their capitals can go and try to earn higher than average profit rates for a period. That leads to political military competition. In other words, it remains internal to the logic of accumulation, competition, the law of value.
So I would like to now see if we can focus on maybe as clearly as possible explaining for people who are newer to these issues how we should understand imperialism as Marxists. And I mean, Jeff, you were just at the end of what you were saying before, try to summarize, in a very compressed way, some really important ideas about that. And I'm wondering if you could start us off by unpacking as clearly as you can, starting from what you were talking about before, how you think we should understand what imperialism is today, including what its relationship is to capitalism.
Sure. So I think the basic challenge for anti-imperialists in the current century is to identify, on the one hand, what fundamentally drives capitalist imperialism across time, while on the other remaining attentive to the various forms it assumes in different historical periods, so that we understand the capitalist global order as being inherently imperialist in character, even if the hierarchies enveloping its constitutive states and the patterns of competition and cooperation between them are subject to change. So this is important as a starting premise because imperialism, in this view, cannot be willed away by peace treaties or transcended through integrated global markets governed by liberal humanitarian order. Global stability, peace, justice, and so on will remain elusive if we are correct, so long as capitalism survives. So that's a basic premise, which doesn't tell us much yet, but is the point of departure, right? So if that's the case, and if all imperialism today is capitalist imperialism, unlike some imperialisms historically, then it makes sense to specify what capitalist imperialism has looked like and what it looks like in the moment, right? And to do that, I think we need to start at the level of the world market for the reasons I tried to already begin to start out with, and which Charlie also mentioned. So that as a point of departure, mature capitalist imperialism, that is capitalist imperialism in the post-war period of the 20th century and to the present, is driven by the universal and impersonal market imperatives that govern capitalist society. So productive wealth or capital is deployed solely to make profit within the disciplinary boundaries of market competition, and survival in the market hinges on the ability of capitalists as capital to effectively increase productivity by accumulating and deploying the most advanced technologies and machinery, squeezing ever more value from labor and searching for new markets with natural resources to commodify cheaper labor to exploit more consumers to purchase their commodities and so on. And all of this is driven through international competition, through the whip of the law of value and competitiveness, and so on. And this is not merely an economic process, but one which entangles all of the projections of state power, in which those of more dominant states attempt to reproduce their position within the hierarchy of states and their capitalist classes with headquarters inside of them. So the key mechanisms of imperialism in this century operate in and through impersonal forces of the world market, even if each imperialist machination is hardly reducible to this immediate economic calculus. So that's the first starting point. The world market as the terrain in which we begin, in which all states, albeit differentially, are subordinate to that operation. Then the multiplicity of states question, right, which I've already begun to do with the critique of empire and the critique of Robinson and so on. But what this means is to stress global interdependence rather than national independence as the point of theoretical departure, right? But that doesn't mean to homogenize the historical specificity of each regional or national path into capitalism. So we can talk about the universal, and we need to, the world market level, and the particular or the national and regional parts of the system, or the abstract dynamics, the general logic of global capitalism. But we also need to then think about all of the mediations to get to the concrete, specific local conditions in which that develops. So it matters intensively whether a state's integration into the world market is at the bottom of the hierarchy of world states or at the top. And the rhythms and patterns of capitalist development and class struggle are conditioned by politics of so-called catch-up development and so on in those states of lower in the order and quite different dynamics in those dominant states of the imperial system. So uneven accumulation on a world scale reinforces and sustains the inherited plural system of states, this plural system of states that capitalism inherited and then expanded upon. And it does so by concentrating geographically investment, markets, and labor in specific national or regional locations of the world economy, such that clusters of capital that privilege certain areas at the expense of others tend to be reinforced over time. And it's primarily through the path-dependent peculiarities of accumulation that hierarchies are reproduced. So this is the beginning of unevenness. But another dimension of unevenness is that it is a source of tension between different imperial states, as well as between imperial states and late developers aspiring or seeking to aspire greater power. So the imperative of capitalist expansion faced by every state leads to intensified competitions for markets and is often accompanied geopolitically by efforts to establish growing spheres of influence. Unevenness, tension, and conflict do not imply the inevitability of war between imperial rivals, or, as we've been mentioning, a kind of simplistic contemporary vindication of classical Marxist theories of the early 20th century. The phenomenal forms of conflict are never merely epiphenomena that mechanically express the fierce disputation of capitalist competition. Ultimately, when it comes to the rhythms of geopolitical competition in concrete settings, these have to do with the conjunctural factors of the intensity of competition, shifts in the balance of forces, the stakes of a given conflict, and the capacity of international institutions to channel tensions away from direct military confrontation. Think of the complexity of the dynamic at the moment of Iran's response to Israel's bombing of the embassy in Damascus, or not the embassy, but the ambassadorial buildings in Damascus, and the contingent chain of events involved in determining this. Right, this can't be merely deduced from the abstract level that we've been talked about, but is nonetheless related to those determining logics. Okay, and finally, the imperialist chain, this notion that we want to retain from Lenin and those who have built on that idea from Lenin. So the argument that Todd and I make is that the world system today is organized along the lines of an imperialist chain. That is a continuum of power that stretches from the imperialist superpower to those states seeking to challenge the dominant power, to secondary imperialist states, to subordinate peripheral states. So each of these constitute links on a chain that is a hierarchical unity of economic and political interdependence, coordination, and conflict. So if there is a crudely coercive element in the reproduction of the United States as the strongest power in the world today, which there obviously is, there is also a more intangible element having to do with the stability and selective opportunities its leadership represents for members positioned throughout the entirety of the imperialist chain. And yet, the notion of a frictionless U.S. supremacy is a fantasy. So this notion of U.S. supremacy, in addition to what I've said earlier, denies the actual complexities of competition and cooperation, antagonism and mutual dependence, all of which run through the hazardous realm of international politics throughout this imperialist chain. So if you take even the politics of allies of the United States within this chain, Canada, Australia, and so on, when Canada or Australia act to subordinate countries of the global south in pursuit of their own capital's interests and so on, these are not reducible to diktats of the US empire, even if Canada and Australia, as weaker secondary imperial powers, have to take carefully into consideration the consequences of their actions in relationship to their dominant ally. Similarly, those states that are antagonistic, non-allied with the United States, have to take into consideration, of course, the US's response, but there's a room for maneuver with potentially serious consequences within that realm, including and up to the possibility of crises of hegemony of US rule. So the point is to avoid a kind of frictionless equilibrium that was predominant to theories in the past, and to simultaneously avoid the distorted mirror image of the multipolarity thesis, which simply celebrates the emergence of this or that and every state as it comes into conflict with the United States, no matter the political consequences or tenor of those disputes.
Yeah, I agree completely with Jeff just said. I just want to expand on a couple of points and maybe give an example, sort of a contemporary example of some of what he's talking about. The expansion is that the whole notion, starting with empire, et cetera, of this sort of homogeneous, flat world where there's no contradictions, no conflicts among capital, et cetera, flows from a notion that free markets and free competition should homogenize capitalists, should make them all about the same, and completely ignores the actual warlike quality of capitalist economic competition. I mean, Sheikh has this aphorism about perfect competition in neoclassical economics is to real competition what ballet is to war. And the reality is, real competition historically throughout the entire history of capitalism has always produced uneven and combined development. That the uneven and combined development at an economic level in terms of where these different societies on the imperialist chain fit is constantly is a product of capitalist competition. It is capitalist competition, not its absence, that produces development at one pole and underdevelopment at the other pole, but with spaces in between. And I think that the formulations that Jeff and Todd make in that article about how to move from that reality of production, circulation, et cetera, to politics are very, very useful in terms of understanding both the limits and the autonomy. And I think one of the things we can see in this is that if you look at, in fact, the current hotspot of the exercise of global imperial power, Palestine, the only way to actually understand that is that it's a sort of framework. The support of the U.S. and most of Western imperialism for the Zionist project from its beginnings was not based on the fact that whether it be the openly anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish bankers or AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, having this inordinate power and buying off politicians in the imperialist states. Instead, it's based on the fact that in order for global capital to be able to extract wealth in alliance with some of the Arab ruling classes in that region, particularly petroleum, etc., they need stable regimes that will police revolts from below. And the Zionist settler state has provided that quite consistently over the last 80 years. It also helps us explain, as Jeff put it, it's the idea that either the U.S. is simply the lapdog of AIPAC, or the notion that Israel is simply the lapdog of U.S. imperialism can't make sense of actually what's going on today. Yes, the U.S. fundamentally will back the state of Israel against any and all challenges, because ultimately this is the most stable capitalist regime in the area, and they require its continued stability and success to police the region. But at the same time, there are tensions. The Israeli ruling class has its own regional imperial interests, particularly tied to its own colonial settler project, where they want to finally have a state from the river to the sea that would be exclusively Hebrew speaking. At the same time, this creates tensions for the U.S. and the other Western powers, not simply because it's embarrassing that they massacre 30, 40,000 Palestinians, mostly unarmed peoples, but because they do not want to lose the support of some of the more conservative Arab regimes who they need as junior partners to Israel in policing this region. So I think this framework, which allows us to understand how the world market accumulation fundamentally limits what states do, their place in this imperial world system, global imperialist chain, and there are spaces within it for contradictions and conflicts amongst them, is extremely important. I mean, it's also very important for us to understand China and why China or the allied BRICS or whatever are not a progressive pro-working class alternative to the Western powers. That these forces themselves have their own imperial interests, that their imperial project, both at the economic level and political military level, requires increased exploitation and repression at home and increased exploitation and repression in the areas in which they are attempting to compete with the established imperialist powers.
So you've provided some very helpful pointers or broad concepts for thinking about imperialism today. And as we move towards the end of our conversation, are there any things you'd like to pinpoint as the most important specific features that of the shape of capitalist imperialism as it exists in the times that we're living today? Maybe just in a kind of schematic way, so that this might help listeners to kind of see what maybe is more specific about imperialism in the shape that it's taking in our times.
Very schematically, I think that the relative decline of U.S. imperialism, not so much vis-a-vis Europe and Japan, but vis-a-vis the rest of the world in terms of its economic position and its political military position, has created the space for at least China to begin to move up what's sometimes called the value production chain economically and begin to exert and project its own political military power in various places of the world. This creates space as well for their allied subordinate powers like Russia, like Iran, like India, etc., to carve out their own particular spheres of influence, their own particular projects. So I think that in the current conjuncture, it's this relative decline of the U.S. and the growing challenge of China and a series of allied capitalist states that I think is one of the most important features of imperialism today. I imagine Jeff would agree with most of that, but would have something much more to say.
I do agree with that, and I think if we continuing on the theme of what we've been talking about throughout, if we historicize the present while emphasizing the particularities of the present, it can be instructive because the dynamic of imperialism across the last few hundred years, I think, has always been an unstable mixture of cooperation and competition. And we have seen powers rise, new ones threaten emergence, old ones decline, and so on. But what I particularly want to emphasize in closing is those historical moments in which there's an acceleration of these processes, right? And these have often accompanied moments of capitalist crisis and reconfiguration. So if you think of the 1870s to 1890s, that crisis and the reconfigurations of imperialism that followed, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the realignment of the world order that followed this, the 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism, the decline of the Soviet Union, and the more intense universalization of capitalism internationally, which had already been achieved by the post-war order. I think the 2008 crisis and its the sort of anemic pace of its stagnant quote-unquote recovery means that it's unsurprising that there is the beginning of a reconfiguration of imperial order in the moment. This doesn't mean that everything is traceable to 2008. The relative decline of the United States begins prior to this. The relative rise of China begins prior to this, and so on. But it's about the accelerating moment of this crisis and to what it's and what it's done, or what it's beginning to do, or to the extent that we can begin to map the opening processes of this reconfiguration without pretending to have a handle on its potential outcomes. So I think, in addition to what Charlie said, and complementing it, we can say that the United States remains the dominant imperialist state, but that the world order is undergoing a reconfiguration, that the international competitiveness of American manufacturing capital is waning, that the dollar's global reserve currency is in decline, even if this is still early days in that process. American power has been unable to integrate China into the world system on its own terms. It's been limited in terms of its war making as a means of leadership, made clear by Iraq and Afghanistan and its outcomes there. And China has seized upon this moment and the 2008 crisis to increase its economic, political, and military influence regionally and beyond. So it has developed, just to concretize some of the points that Charlie already made, it has developed multinational corporate champions to compete with its American and European counterparts. It has secured access to the raw materials of poorer and weaker countries to feed its industrial and high-tech growth, while ensnaring those countries in new relations of indebtedness. It maintains its global dominance in the critical minerals industry. Its defense budget has expanded rapidly and may exceed standard U.S. estimates of its size. It is capable of asserting military predominance in the South China Sea. And if we shift from China for a second, if we look beyond its nuclear capacities, Russia is neither a great power nor an emergent one, but it too has seized upon the opening provided by the instabilities of American hegemony and export earnings drawn from the European Union dependency on its oil and gas to reassert its claim over a sphere of influence that extends back to the pre-Soviet Russian Empire. So even if Russia does not represent a potential challenger to U.S. dominance in the way that China potentially does, it nonetheless exposes the autonomy, the growth of an autonomous room for maneuver related to U.S.'s relative decline and China's relative emergence. So I think we need to be open-ended and empirically driven in our response to what we see develop, and be open to surprise in terms of what may or may not develop from these early configurations. And I think what today's discussion has allowed us to do is at least to point to those areas that we ought to pay attention to in terms of trying to delineate the underlying dynamics of this.
And I'll just mention that listeners who are interested in some of the more specific issues may be wanting to look back at episodes 31 and 33 of Victor's Children, which were about US imperialism and Chinese imperialism, respectively. The last issue we should talk about before we wrap up is about the political implications of all this. Because there are certain kind of implications for socialists of how we understand what imperialism is and isn't. So would you like to draw out some of the political implications? You've touched on this through the discussion, but maybe focus on political implications for socialists of how you think we should understand imperialism today.
All right, I'll start it off. I mean, in some ways, I think the sort of theoretical framework that Jeff and I put forward actually puts us back to the politics that Lenin and the revolutionary wing of the socialist movement was putting forward in the early 20th century, which is there are multiple imperialisms. None of them are the friends of working people and oppressed people, and that imperialism will create greater instability in the world, and it will continue to require the subordination of states and societies to itself. So I think at a more concrete level, this means a reassertion of an internationalism from below, an anti-imperialism from below, which looks at not simply that the sole enemy is at home, U.S. imperialism, but the imperialist system and the imperialist rivalries. None of these are our friends. That the left should not be looking to rival imperial powers to the U.S. and states that oppose the U.S. as some sort of progressive alternative, but because they themselves, in their rivalry with the U.S., need to suppress and exploit their own populations. And thus, we defend actual popular movements against imperialism, whether those are in the Ukraine or in Palestine, in Latin America, etc., but without any illusions about either the Chinese or Russian state or the more subordinate states that are allied with their camp, whether that be Assad's Syria, whether it be the Iranian regime, whether it be Venezuela, etc. So that's, I think, for me, the political conclusion is, again, a return to a politics of a working class internationalism that doesn't look to states, but looks to classes and popular movements as the source of anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist struggle.
And I think, I agree with the contours of what Charlie was laying out. And on top of that, if we think about a specific region of the world that I follow more closely than others, other regions, Latin America, I think all of these imperial dynamics have opened up contradictions in distinct ways, some of them more politically favorable and some of them less politically favorable or even dire in their consequences. So on the one hand, you can look at the rapid rise of Chinese industrial accumulation. One consequence of that was the shifting of the entirety of South America in terms of its principal commercial exchange partners from the U.S. as its first export market to China. Not true of Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico, but true of South America. And the massive commodity boom that drove up capitalist dynamism for a brief window of the so-called pink tide governments, right? One of the potentialities of that moment was a lessening of the capacity of the U.S. to discipline South America in typical ways. So, for example, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for the first decade of this century basically had nothing to do with Latin America for the first time in about 20 years because of the commodities boom. It doesn't say anything about an escape from capitalism, obviously, or even serious reform. But what it meant was a different relationship with the dominant power of the U.S. Now, some of the even reformist possibilities of that moment were building a closer regional integration of Latin America. So the notion of Alba, at the height of this, the notion of a shared currency, the notion of a shared developmental bank that wouldn't be operative purely on market imperatives. These were the kind of moments, obviously, within capitalism, no challenge to capitalism. They really didn't get off the ground, but they were a potentiality in which what it would mean if we had if those on the left who saw China also as imperialist, what it meant was that they wanted to negotiate the terrain in which they would have to deal with Chinese imperialism as a collective entity or region in which they would be far less easy to subordinate in aggressive ways than if they were to individually bilaterally negotiate with China, which is what ended up happening. But nonetheless, even though that collapsed, that the ideas of part of the reformist left that China wasn't an imperialist power, but was somehow a negotiating partner to get out of the dominance of the United States, meant that there's a sense in which China is an opportunity to be seized, even on sections of the revolutionary left, an opportunity to be seized in terms of allowing for a different South-South relationship in the development of the region. And I think this fundamentally misunderstands the subordinate asymmetrical relation of every bilateral relation between China and Latin America in this dynamic, and the completely predictable and classically imperialist dynamic of that. As you can see, as China calls in its debts, that it extended in very typical terms. So the terms of repayment are aggressive, punitive, and destructive in just the same ways that you would imagine any commercial bank or any Inter-American Development Bank or any International Monetary Fund loaned or World Bank of the past. So in other words, although there's no history of Chinese imperialism in Latin America historically, this new phenomenon, so there's no history of imperial violence, there's no recent memory of backing of coups and so on, as the entire 20th century was in its relationship to the United States. An accurate assessment of where that direction is headed and how the Latin American left ought to associate with depends on a correct theoretical understanding of it as an imperial power. So it's not merely a kind of academic discussion as to how you theorize Chinese power in relationship. And I mean, the same could be said for sub-Saharan Africa and what have you. So these are really the splits on the left that I think are important in those regions of the world, those that are trying to see state-state alignments with this multipolar moment as an opportunity from the point of view of basically developing more autonomous capitalist development, and those who wanted to challenge both their own states as effectively pipelines of the reproduction of imperial capitalist order at home. And so that who are the real anti-imperialists? Basically, those who are on the front lines of class struggle against the expansion of extractive frontiers into the Amazon, or the ostensibly left-wing states who are backing those capital projects, displacing people and burning, a fundamental source of the survival of our species. So the questions are not small as to how one thinks about imperialism, and therefore how one understands anti-imperialism and the forms that it assumes.
I think we'll just wrap up there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.